P.M.H. Atwater spoke recently to the South Bay chapter of IANDS, the International Association for Near-Death Studies. P.M.H. has written more than 15 books on the near-death experience and is a 3-time experiencer herself. And she's one of the original researchers in the field of near-death studies. Here she talked about spiritually transforming experiences with the near-death experience as a model.
His place I spend the night. It's good to see Mel and Thomas here. It's good to see all of your faces. This is wonderful to see so many of you here. You wanted to know more about spiritually transforming experiences. I'm going to use the near-death experience as a model to help us all understand what this might be like, where it might be going. When we're looking at near-death experiences, they happen to anyone at any age. That includes a lot of them happen in birth trauma. Some of them happen before the child is born. If you get the book, The New Children and Near-Death Experiences, which is here, it's the most in-depth book ever written on child experiencers. John Leonia has the frontispiece. John Leonia had his experience in his mother's vagina as he was being born. So when I say anyone at any age can have one, I mean just that, whether they're born or not. I mean anyone, anywhere in the world. Doesn't matter your culture. So we're talking about a dynamic that is front and center. It's a particular dynamic that we cannot deny. Also bear in mind that the near-death experience normally happens to people in somehow connected to violence or trauma, so they often have a body to rebuild after it's over. We're talking about something that's absolutely front and center in the person's life, just like a power punch, hits just like a power punch, stops the life, dead center, that's it. You need to take care of this. You need to look at this or go through this. But the near-death experience has physiological after effects as well as psychological after effects. We're talking about a pattern of after effects that's equally dynamic to the experience itself. When we're talking about the various experiences, let me say that it is international, this is global, the pattern is global, but the variations in the pattern or the different experiences of the pattern people might have are very individual. So you're with me on that. The way people describe their experience depends entirely on language constraints and cultural exposure. So you're going to hear variations on the theme, whether you're a fundamentalist Christian, whether you're a person in Thailand, whether you're someone in Australia, Japan, Israel, they will tend to describe the experience according to what they're capable of describing. So you're going to have variations, even with children. They say out of the mouth of babes, well, take a look at the babes. What have they been exposed to since birth? What were they exposed to while the mother was carrying the child in the womb? What was the child hearing? So take a good look at all of that. In my research base with children, about 50% of them could remember their birth. Another third had pre-birth memory. Pre-birth memory began around 7 months in utero, or the third trimester. The brain is working by then. A child in the womb can see, hear, remember, intuit, and choose. So we're not talking about some little clump of blood and bone and maybe muscle. We're talking about something that is, for all extents and purposes, a human being and very real. If you've ever read my book, the Big Book of Near-Death Experiences, there's a section in that book called Womb with a View. These kids remember a lot. Let me give you an example. It's always good to give examples. This is of a girl. Mother pregnant. 2 months before delivery, she went in, no heartbeat. For all extents and purposes, this is a stillborn. So the doctor said, maybe it's time to just come in and remove the child. Came home with the news. The father becomes very enraged because that's his son. He'd made up his mind. That's his son. He became drunk. Picked up, he started throwing things in the house, furniture everywhere. Picked up his wife, threw her into the corner of a very strong wooden table. Split open the front of her. They had to rush her to the hospital. Delivered the baby. Yes, stillborn. Put the baby over, on a counter somewhere. Did what they could to save the mother. And after a while, they looked at this little hairy, funny piece over here on the counter, and it was beginning to breathe. So the doctors went to the parents and said, well, could we have your permission to run medical experiments on this baby? Looks like the child obviously is, lots of things wrong with this child. May we have your permission to use, medical experiments? The parents said yes. And so they did that for a month. Thank God, because that's what saved the child. This interesting thing about this case is that the doctor never reported the abuse of the mother and the drunken father, because the doctor was the father's drinking buddy. Okay? So when this child now is about 2 years old, they had many members of the family in. This is a living room, kind of a family gathering. Her name is Leslie. Leslie marched up to her dad and out loud, in front of everybody, pointing her finger, gave back to her father every word he said and everything he did when he threw the mother across the room. She described every condition of every piece of furniture. She described in detail everything he did in the living room and to her mother. Now, bear in mind, she's still in the womb and supposedly dead. When I talk about womb with a view, I'm not kidding. It's amazing what an unborn child can see and hear and even give back to the parents once they're born. Another case in point, if you want to hang on with this one for a little bit, this is another girl. When she's about maybe 3 or 4, this one, pretty good conversant with language now. She went up to her mother and pulling on her mother's dress and kept saying, "Why did you try to kill me when I was in your tummy?" The mother never tried to get an abortion, but she thought about it. She already had about 3 or 4 kids. There was hardly any money left. She was really worried about having another child. How could they afford it? What could they do? And so she visualized and thought heavily about aborting the child. She did not do it, but the child got the message. Why did you try to kill me when I was in your tummy? The mother became very traumatized. I had a long talk and a long session with her because the mother was still getting over this. The child was getting kind of feisty. She was sort of holding her own, but mom was having some problems with this, i.e. guilt. We have all kinds of cases, naturally. Let me say that the most common components of the near-death experience, the ones you hear the most of over and over and over again, number one, the out-of-body experience. That has, by far, more people have that than anybody else. This out-of-body experience is clear, it's lucid, it's detailed. Most of the cases I know of, if there is something in that experience that could be verified, it has been by third-party testimonials. Number two, the second most common, the light. There's something about this light. Adults describe it as brighter than 10,000 suns. So obviously we're not talking about yard lights. A really bright light that knows your name, knows all about you, can converse with you, have a dialogue with you. There's something very loving and accepting about this light. The third most common component is a greeter of some kind. In most cases, it's a loved one who's died and gone on before you. It can also be a pet that's gone on before you. There's lots of animals in near-death cases. With children, you see a lot of birds, lots of birds in children's cases, bunnies, bunnies, every once in a while a turtle or a little puppy dog. With adults, you see a lot of dogs, some cats, but a lot of dogs, horses, and lions. Why lions? I do not know, don't ask me. But they're there. So a lot of animals. The greeters can be a light being, or a bright one, or an angel, or a guide or guardian. Children will seldom use the term angel unless they heard that from their parents. So that's one way you can tell if the child's case is really genuine, especially if they're very young. They'll tend to call them the people, or the bright ones, or the loving people. It's only when they're older that they will use terms like angels. You can also be met by religious figures, or significant figures of some kind. Once in a while you're met by the living. Now this happens sometimes in adult cases. It happens more commonly in children's cases, where they're met by their grade school teacher, or maybe the kid down the block, that are very much alive. And what I've noticed in these cases is that living being stays for as long as it takes to alert or relax the experiencer, and then they're gone. And then the typical imagery of a near-death experience takes over. So for what it's worth, they seem to be there for a reason, and that reason, I think, is to alert or relax the experiencer. And once that's done, again, they're gone. So you know, the greeter. After that, you know, you get life reviews. There's a fair amount of life reviews. Sometimes it's seeing your life, maybe bits and pieces of the life, certain parts of the life, sometimes from birth to death, sometimes the other way around, from death to birth. Sometimes it's like being in a movie theater and there's a big screen and you're watching, like sitting in a theater. Other times it's like going into a great big room. Maybe you're reading something like the Book of Life. There's been several people say that in this big room are shelves and shelves and shelves, and they're filled with TV sets. And each TV set is tuned to a different aspect of your life. And you can pick which one you want to go into. You hear that every once in a while. Once in a while you get the radical kind. In my case, I had one of these where this happened in my second near-death experience, where I relived birth to death. I relived every thought I had ever thought, every word I had ever spoken, every deed I had ever done, plus the effect of that on anyone who came into my environment, whether I met them or not, plus the effect of that on the air, the water, the soil, the animals, the plants. So I got the total gestalt of my ever having existed in the earth plane. And that was a heavy for me, really heavy. From my research base, a criminal type, mafia kind of guy, in Chicago, interestingly enough. In his life review, he had to experience the pain and suffering of everyone he'd ever hurt or maimed or killed, plus the pain and suffering of their families and the ripple effect. And for him, again, that was quite horrific. When I met him, he was serving soup in a church kitchen for the needy. He just simply couldn't go back to any other. He wanted some way to sort of make up for what he did. He couldn't go back to a life of crime, certainly, or any kind of normal life. So once in a while you get people who have the heavies. But most of them don't. Most of them, it's a kind of a detached viewing, sort of a safe viewing, sort of a learning experience that they are somehow attached and they're looking at this without the pain, learning from from the life review. But not everybody has that kind. Don't believe that they're all like that, because they're not. Some people go through the pain. There are those, of course, who have the components of hopping a light ray and touring the universe, maybe seeing all of history from beginning to end, maybe winding up in some kind of heavenly college taking classes. You know, we get all kinds of stories, but those are the main ones. Notice I did not use the term tunnel. Not that many people experience a tunnel. I do not consider the tunnel to be a signature feature of the near-death experience. Certainly some people experience it. There's probably people sitting in here right now that experienced it. But what I'm saying to you is most people do not. The scientific survey that was done by Gallup Poll in 1982 found 9% of the near-death experiences nationwide experienced a tunnel. Where we started having lots and lots of reports of tunnels was after the media had sensationalized Raymond Moody's first book, Life After Life. And then you started getting lots of tunnels. I do not think anybody's lying or stretching the truth. Rather, when you go through one of these experiences, what were words do you use? How do you describe it? You're really looking for a word of some kind. You know, what do I say? And they hear this interesting term called tunnel. I say, you know, maybe that describes the darkness I was in. Or maybe that describes the whooshing sound as I whizzed through. You know, maybe I went through a tunnel. So, yeah, I really think that's why we now hear every once in a while the term tunnel. However, if you get out of the United States, if you get out of maybe half of Europe and Canada, you don't hear the word tunnel at all. People, very seldom do people in other countries experience anything even like a tunnel. So we're talking now about a particular dynamic that that really catches our fancy, that really stops us, and we want to look at it and say, well, maybe this means there's an afterlife. You know, gets rid of our fear of death. If you take a look at the words people say after their experience, the most common 4 words that experiencers say after their experience is over is, always there is life. Now hang with that for a minute. If always there is life, then how can there be a before life? How can there be an afterlife? How can there be a now life if always, in some form, in some place, you're alive? You've always been alive. You're alive now. You always will be alive. Eternity can be counted on because eternity is all there is. So it invites you to think about that a little bit differently. And we're looking at the children's cases, we're looking at the adult cases, and all they're saying and all they're describing about other worlds and otherworldly journeys. But what fascinates me so much is the after effects. And we don't spend that much time talking about the after effects. Did you realize that the pattern of after effects are just as physiological as they are psychological? There's a pattern of physiological after effects. And it's just as important and just as strong and just as powerful as the psychological one. Let me just sort of bounce through that and say that the physiological after effects, for most experiencers, not everybody, there's always exceptions for most experiencers, it causes changes in brain structure and brain function. It causes changes in the nervous system and the digestive system, and changes in skin sensitivity. To the point that lowers blood pressure, you can handle stress easier. Many of us have electrical sensitivity. We're very sensitive to electronic things and light bulbs and lightning and earthquakes and tornadoes. These kind of weather anomalies have a lot of electricity in them or electrical anomalies in them, and they can affect experiencers in specific ways. I've got a paper on that right now going through peer review for the Journal of Near-Death Studies. Here's hoping it makes it, but anyway. Eventually the paper will be out, I think. My hope is. We're talking about significant changes in the body. We're also talking about significant changes in the mind and the personality of the individual. You're more acquainted with those. Loss of the fear of death, becoming more humanitarian, more loving, more creative, more spiritual. You're acquainted with these kinds of ones, but you're not necessarily that acquainted with the physiological. The physiological also includes a sensitivity to light and sun, sensitivities to sound. At near-death conferences now that the IANDS, the International Association of Near-Death Studies, IANDS, holds, we ask that the cameras, as much as possible, be in the back of the room or out in the hall, because the experiencers experience those flashes and all that extra light as painful. We also ask that the mic the sound system be turned down a little bit. That also can be very painful. Some people go through different aspects of dealing with sunshine afterward. Some of them need more and more sun. They don't seem to get quite enough of it. Other people become very sensitive to sunburns and that kind of thing. Let me give you a little example from my own life. My husband is an African American. His name is Terry. He's sort of black and I'm sort of white. Actually, I'm speckled and actually he's sun-bronzed, but you know, that's the way it is. And for about 7 years after my experience, if I was out in the sun for more than 15-20 minutes, I would turn orange. Now notice I didn't say pink. I didn't say red. I said orange. And this one particular day we were in downtown Harrisonburg, Virginia, and I had turned orange and he's black and we looked like Halloween. And Terry wouldn't walk with me anymore. I mean, we really looked weird. Halloween, here we go. So yeah, it changes your eating habits, and you know, just a lot of really significant changes. But one of the most significant is, and let me sort of lead into this, the average time that an individual is without vital signs. That means no breath, that means no heartbeat, no brainwave function, is 5 to 20 minutes. That's average. Now we all know that the brain needs to have oxygen in 3 to 4 minutes or you have brain damage. Most of these people come back without brain damage. Few have it, but not that many. Most of them come back with brain enhancement. I consider that a feature of the near-death experience. You come back smarter than you were before. With children, the jump is significant.
Pilgrim, how you journey on the road.